Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the MGT and GCC presents to you IDeny Divine Essence in You, and this is our Instagram Live series. I'm Sister Naya, and today I will be hosting alongside my dearest sister, one of my dearest sisters, Anura Muhammad. Oh, here she is live in our live series, and while we wait for our Sister Anora, our first live. Oh, there she is. Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome.
Praise be to Allah. I'm happy that you're here. I was just reminding us of our first and second live. Our first live was just an introduction to our live series and who we are. And our second live was co-hosted by Sister Amira, and it was a live testimonial by Sister Rosalynn X. Praise be to Allah.
I don't think I the sister's Instagram name. You know her Instagram, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So Nora's gonna go ahead and introduce herself.
Me? Oh, you already. Well, assalamu alaikum. My name is Anora. I'm 23 years old, out of the Central Region, and today we have a very special guest. She is someone who I was blessed to meet over social media last year. And when I tell you all that this sister is amazing, she is absolutely amazing. We are definitely in for a treat this evening. And the way that she is able to just instantly break down the most profound concepts that have taken me years to understand still blows my mind. So it is truly my honor and privilege to introduce to you all our beloved Sister Rosalynn.
Yay, I'll praise it to Allah. She should be, it should take, okay, there we go.
Hey.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
That's a beautiful introduction, Anora. Okay, so Sister Rosalynn is going to go ahead and introduce herself now so that we all get to be acquainted with her loveliness.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm Sister Rosalynn. I'm from Muhammad Mas number 7 in Brooklyn. I am a therapist, licensed therapist with a specialty working with teenagers and young adults, usually around the difficulties and challenges of becoming an adult in this specific day and time. That's the kind of work that I do for the most part.
Wow. I feel like I'm very close to this camera. Well, all praises due to Allah. Thank you, Sister Rosalynn, for taking the time out of your busy schedule, which I'm sure it is very busy, to join us on our live series. And thank you for all of the amazing work that you do for our young people. It's very necessary.
Yes, and thank you, Sister Rosalynn. We have a few questions for you. And the first one will be, what is self-care and how can we practice it?
That's a great question. I get that question a lot because a lot of people, when they think about self-care, they're actually thinking about self-soothing. And self-care is tending to, nurturing, and being an adequate guardian over yourself. Here in the nation, we are given general orders, and our first, number one general order is to take charge of this post and all temple property in view. And what that means is that we have the general orders or principles that we could apply to general situations in life that all of us at some point are going to experience. With that being said, our first post is ourself. We are, as women, we are a temple where Allah dwells. A space or a person or even a thing that is connected to God is considered sacred. So how would we take care of something that is sacred? When we think about that, you take really good care of it. You know, when something's sacred, you dedicate time, you dedicate energy, you dedicate resources to make sure that it is in the best condition that it could be in. And we also take very special care to make sure that no outside forces come in and disrespect that sacredness. And we are sacred. We are the women of God. So in mental health, that limit to protect from outside forces is called a boundary. So a boundary is a limit or a threshold when something becomes other than itself after that certain threshold. So an example would be, for example, if you put a pot of water to boil on the stove, at some point it reaches a threshold, a limit of heat, where it's no longer liquid, it becomes a gas. That's a limit and a threshold where it becomes other than what it was. So with people, we have certain limits. Some of us may not really have a good idea of what certain limits are. That's something that we could explore and figure out. But for example, and a lot of us have this, we could have a limit in terms of friendships and venting with friends, right? We all have a limit to that. And a limit could be when you vent or you experience someone venting to you, where you start having a response. It could be anxiety, it could be feeling overwhelmed, feeling sad. And that would be a limit. The boundary wouldn't be the limit. The boundary would be the action, the behavioral consequence once you reach that limit. For example, a boundary could look like putting your phone on do not disturb at a certain point in the night, in the evening. It could be letting your friend know, like, hey, we could talk later tonight, or it could be, let's talk in the week, and that's a better day for me in the week to discuss something. That's a boundary. And part of the boundary setting also would include having a conversation where you communicate the limit and what the consequence would be, preferably before. And then once that conversation and that expectation is discussed, then actually following that guideline is crucial. Otherwise, it's not a boundary, it's just an empty threat.
I like that.
I like that too. I'm definitely learning over here. And I know I'm a person that needs to establish more boundaries in my life, which I'm working on. So I appreciate having this discussion about boundaries and setting limits for ourselves, because it's really important. And it's definitely a part of taking care of ourselves, allowing what comes in and what goes out. So thank you for that answer. Now, that leads us to our next question, which is, what does self-soothing mean? We heard you mention it. Would you be able to share an example of self-soothing? And is self-soothing a good thing?
Okay, sure. Self-soothing is a tool. And like I said earlier, self-soothing is what most people think of when they think of self-care. It's the bubble bath, it's the chocolate cake, it's the retail therapy. That's self-soothing. And it is an activity that helps alleviate pain. That's the best way to explain it. Pain doesn't have to be physical. It could be an emotional pain. It could be a mental pain. Whatever alleviates, like a rapid painkiller kind of relief to numb the pain, that's self-soothing. So it helps in the sense of it reduces the pain at the moment. It's soothing, but it does not address the root cause. And that's the difference between self-care and self-soothing as well. A nice simile to understand the concept of self-soothing would be, like, for example, an EpiPen. An EpiPen is what, it's an emergency allergic reaction medication. So when someone's is at the verge of anaphylaxis, for example, they have some kind of allergic reaction, you use the EpiPen, and it's an emergency medication, and it saves lives. Like, self-soothing really could save life in terms of helping you feel better at the moment. But you wouldn't actively go into situations that could harm you and then be like, well, I have the EpiPen, I'll be fine. Like, I'll just do retail therapy afterwards and I'll be okay. You wouldn't use self-soothing in that way. It would be something that you would use to feel better, to balance yourself out at the moment when you're dealing with something that's tough, that's intense, but it's rapid. It's like at the moment, emergency relief, but it's not something to maintain or to address the concerns. So I mentioned retail therapy, but self-soothing, a lot of times, especially as women, it could be eating sweets for us. We could eat cakes, sweets, pastries, chocolates, to the point of getting a stomach ache sometimes, and it tastes really good at the moment when you're doing it. But then if you rely on it as an emotional soothing, over time, you could start overeating. You could get cavities. You could gain unhealthy weight. It could affect your insulin response. And if it affects your insulin response, it affects your hormones. And over time, that's what happens when you eat too many sweets, right? It's the same thing with self-soothing. If you rely on it, more than self-care, it starts creating damage in your life and negative effects in your life. And that's not to say we don't eat sweets, like ever, like never again in life. That's not what I'm saying. Like, enjoy the sweets, but in moderation. It's something that we could use once in a while, and that's self-soothing.
Wow, yes, ma'am. Thank you. Everything in moderation is key. But that just reminded me, I've been craving sweets so much these past couple of days. Today, last night, I was eating some cookies. And I was just like, why am I even eating this cookie right now? What is this cookie doing for me right now? But I have so many self-soothing habits that aren't necessarily healthy. Retail therapy is definitely one for me. But yes, ma'am. I know every time I do get stressed out, I start to pick out clothes in my closet and style this outfit. That's my self-soothing.
And it works. That's why we do it.
Yes, ma'am.
And actually, Sister Rosalynn, when you were speaking, it made me think of, a baby. When they're crying, you can put a pacifier in that baby's mouth, but eventually that baby gonna let you know, look, it's time to eat. I want some real food. So
That's right.
yeah, I do a lot of self-soothing, and I know I'm not alone. So that's why this conversation is absolutely necessary. So thank you so much again for sharing your wisdom. So I have another question. I know you briefly touched on this on your other response, but can you explain again the difference between self-care and self-soothing?
Of course. And it is good to revisit it because it's so easy to confuse the two because they do go hand in hand, right? So since we're on the topic of general orders, indiscriminately, and that's the key word, indiscriminately using self-soothing at the expense of self-care is a real life example of not following our fifth general order. Our fifth general order is to not quit, to quit your post only when properly relieved. And an example of that in terms of our everyday life would be to neglect yourself, your post, as to neglect it as the temple of God. So for an example, it would be trying to think of a really good example for retail therapy, since we're talking about that. I've been there before in the past. I've got a lot better about that. But sometimes we could do retail therapy at the expense of our finances. And that's not taking care of your post, because then in the future, you may not have a bill that you can't pay, or you may have some kind of an emergency that you can't cover financially because you relied on self-soothing instead of self-care. So it really is about being a good custodian over yourself, a good guardian, and it's consistently showing up for yourself and doing the activities that may not be like enjoyable at the very moment, but in the long run, it will lead to happiness, peace, and contentment of mind. So when you think about it in that way, in terms of short term and the long term, it helps clear up what the difference is.
Wow. See, I had to write that down. Self-care is consistently showing up for yourself. Like, that is so, like, simplest steps. That's literally self-care. All praises to Allah, man. You know what? I told you all that we were in for a treat. So thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am. And just listening to your response, I really appreciated how you connected ourselves to the general orders, and how taking care of ourselves is our post, because that gives me a different perspective of taking care of myself and self-care. Because what I'll do, I know we're taught self first and others, but what I tend to do is everything else, and then at the end of the day when I'm already tired, I'm like, okay, now it's just me, but I'm already tired and there's only so much I can do now. So I really appreciate your response, because it was really something to think about for myself, and I'm sure many others too. It's a struggle. It really is a struggle sometimes. Now we have another question for you. Why is it so important to practice both, which is self-care and self-soothing, especially as women?
Yes, it's important to use both. They're both skills. So it's not to say that one is terrible and never do it, or the other one's like the only thing you could do and never have anything nice in life. Like, that's definitely not what we're saying. You know, there are things that you would use in a balance. And the reason that it's important to use both is because as women, in my I like studying epigenetics, and epigenetics is the study of the inheritance of genes throughout the generations. And what I found in my research is that women, our life experiences, like the story of our lives, like our biography, is actually encoded in DNA and passed down through generations more than men. So for the research I've seen is that for women, we have a ratio of 3 generations versus 1 generation for men that we impact. And that's the minimum. I've seen some as high as 14 generations versus 1 or 2 generations for men. So how we address life, how our life experiences and our life skills, they're encoded in the genes, and then they're passed down through generations as genetic inheritance. We hold a lot of influence over generations and generations and generations. So we literally, like quite literally, we can increase the internal fortitude, the mental fortitude, that strength of our children just by accepting our own, being ourselves, taking charge of our post and all temple property and view. Like, we could give them strength for generations to come just by taking care of ourselves and following our general orders.
Wow.
I'm gonna have to sit on that. And you know, I'm always reaching out to you, asking you questions, because it's just like, that was like one paragraph and sparks. It's just, wow. But let me ask you this, because it's important. How does all of this tie into women being the second selves of God?
Okay. So I brought up epigenetics and the genetic inheritance that we have as women in a way that men do, like Y chromosomes do, but not to the degree that we do as women. So I remember a lecture. It was student minister Ishmael. He mentioned in a lecture where the word Genesis from the Bible contains the word gene at the very beginning. And in physics, it's called the Newton's third law, but we know the originator made that order into existence. So it's the originator's third law. Let's put it that way. He set up a law where for every action or force, there is an opposite and equal force. So we also know that there's a spiritual principle to every physical principle. That being said, epigenetics, it studies that inheritance of genes, but I think there's something really important in looking at our heritage as well as women. So we could affect at the least 3 generations, maybe 14 generations in the future. We also could look at the past and the amount of women in our lineage that have affected us, that have affected us in a good, positive way, maybe in a not so good way, that have affected us as well. So when you look at the past, especially women, we come from women. So it's a direct line of one woman birthing another woman, all the way to that first woman, like the actual second self of Allah, like the first one created. And it's not just like, oh, it's no big deal, just because we're women, but it's huge. Like, I like to call it the network of wombs. There's a certain connection we have as women worldwide, and also in terms of time in the future and in the past. And what I've noticed is that when we connect the dots of those collective lives that women in their lives have lived, we have access to the wisdom of all the women who ever lived, all the experiences they've ever had, all their strengths, all the challenges they've overcome, all the wonderful talents they've ever had. If you look at a book, any book about history, if you look at the women and the accomplishments they've made, through our wombs, we have access to that information through our genes. So in the lecture series, Giving Birth to a God, Mr. Farrakhan lets us know that our wombs are Allah's laboratory. So we work with Allah to bring the next generation in. And in this partnership, we really strive to follow our general orders, to be the best person we could be, to take care of ourselves, And the more that we strive, the more Allah reveals the spiritual aspect of physical principles that we're seeing in the world. And with this new awareness, we incorporate self-care, self-soothing, because it has its place. Allah promises luxury too, you know, so we have the self-care, we have the self-soothing, and we start to develop a life, a healthy life, where we have space and environment where we can truly get to learn ourselves as a woman and individual and navigate life challenges without losing peace and contentment of mind. And as we do that, it just creates more links to those future generations where they also get access to all of those wonderful life skills, strengths, talents that come from just being a woman and coming from women, like all the way from the first woman. And I think that's huge.
Wow. All praises to Allah. It's so interesting to think about how things are literally passed from mother to daughter, daughter to her daughter, and so on. I heard you say that there was one family who went back 14 generations.
Yes.
That's so amazing. That's so amazing. But thank you so very much for joining us today, Sister Rosalynn. And self-care is such an important subject, and we have got to know how to take care of ourselves so that we can live our best life.
That's right.
Yes, ma'am. And thank you again so very much for joining us and taking the time out of your day to be IDeny's special guest for today.
Yes,
Thank you
ma'am.
so much. I'm honored to be here in all of your presence and in the presence of Allah's people. And thank you for inviting me. I'm honored.
Ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
As nice for joining us, for being our special guest. We love you. And Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Assalamualaikum. We appreciate you and all that you do.